Hello and welcome to our podcast on the political spectrum. This is another foundational concept and idea for studying government. There's a lot of great information in here that's going to help you build a foundation for understanding how government and politics work. So let's dive right in and figure out what we're talking about here. So first off, what is this political spectrum? It's not something you can go out and touch, something you can see. It is the concept of the range of political attitudes of the public. And you can see a picture over here on the right. Don't get bogged down in the details quite yet. We will definitely build up to this and explain this throughout the course of the podcast. But you can see a spectrum is just a way of classifying something in terms of its position on a sliding scale. It's not that a person is this or this only, or that the only answer is to be here on the spectrum. There are not black and white moments. There's a lot of gray area here that we want to talk through. And there's certainly no right or wrong in this process. If after all of this discussion and all of this thinking and critical thinking and applying what you know and what you think you know and what you want to believe in terms of the different issues, and that places you in the moderate category, fine. That's great. You are what you are. There's not a judgment involved here. It's just figuring out what you believe as a person, what you believe in terms of politics and government and issues in the world, and then being able to figure out where you fit on this spectrum, where belief systems fit on this spectrum, how the issues are treated by this spectrum. And usually we talk about someone being more something than someone else. So politician A is very liberal. Okay, fine. We can kind of figure out what they think, feel, and believe about the issues when they have the label of liberal associated with them. But then politician B might be more conservative than politician A. And politician C might be even more conservative, but they might be more liberal than politician D. So again, it's a sliding scale of where people could fit, of where you might fit. It's not a right or a wrong. It's just understanding your world, understanding the issues of the day, and understanding some of the labels and nomenclature that go into the realm of political science. So where does this concept come from? This is not something we've made up just for our class. The concept of the spectrum has been around for a long time. During the French Revolution in 1789, the king was in charge. The people of France were not happy. So the French Revolution happens. And at one point, an angry mob stormed this castle called the Bastille. It was a show of power and of their rebellion. And so this group called the National Assembly became the acting government, because the king was captured and then beheaded. And so the people were in charge of themselves. And this group called the National Assembly had to now create a government. And so their goal was to write that new constitution. Like, how would France be ruled now that the king is without his head? So the major question France had to deal with is how much power should the king or the central government have after this moment? Because previous to the revolution, the king had almost unlimited power. He could do whatever he wanted without any checks and balances, without anybody telling him, "Are you sure you want to do that?" And so the people had gotten angry enough. They had ended the monarchy, but there was still this question: how powerful should a king or central government be? And so this is where it gets really interesting. Those who wanted to change to something new, this idea of limiting the king's power, sat on the left of the president in the meeting hall. And those who wanted to maintain tradition, allowing a strong central government, sat on the right of the president. So you get people sitting with people who think like they do, physically on the left or on the right of the creation process here. And those physical locations of being more to the left end up being on the left-hand side of the political spectrum today. And those who prefer to maintain tradition migrate to the right of this concept. And so we want to loop in the idea of economics here as we go. There are costs and benefits to all choices, just as a general statement for economics. And costs and benefits are seen from the decision maker's perspective. So you. As you are hearing these ideas, as you are studying the issues, as you are trying to figure out who you are and what you value and what you believe, you determine what is a cost or a benefit to you. And there are always going to be costs and benefits to perspectives and to choices. So as you are hearing all this and you're like, man, I really believe this about climate change, fine, there are costs and benefits to that. But I also believe this about, say, gun control. There are going to be costs and benefits there. So it's not that there's one right answer here. We're trying to help you figure out what you think and feel and believe about specific issues. And then whatever you think, feel, and believe, we can help you figure out where that puts you on the political spectrum. Now, are there limitations to this line model, this spectrum model? Of course there are. People are very complicated. They have all kinds of beliefs. They may believe something very liberal about this one issue, but then be very conservative on another issue. It's impossible to perfectly quantify somebody's beliefs. And so we wouldn't want to paint with that kind of big brush. You can certainly have nuance within people, within groups, within regions of the country. So there are other models out there. You are more than welcome to look these up and do some more digging and exploring if this is something of interest to you. We have chosen the kind of the bare minimum spectrum, left and right, based off of that early French Revolution model, but you can certainly learn a whole bunch of other labels and titles that exist in the world that might be more nuanced and might fit you more specifically than just being more left or more right. So what determines someone's placement on here as you're trying to figure out, well, where do I fit on the spectrum? Where do my parents fit? Where does my pastor fit? Really, it's what a person believes about certain issues. And we'll talk about all the issues of grown-up America that are out there that people are debating. What are those issues? What do the two sides really think about these issues? And then what do you think about those issues? And as you figure out what you think about, what you care about, what you value, that might help your placement on this spectrum. And so political scientists, not us, have determined, for example, if one person believes this about a certain issue, that's seen as the more liberal thinking on that issue. And at the same time, if a person thinks B about an issue, that is seen as the more conservative belief on that issue. And so the big idea, kind of the embedded, the base model of what this is really talking about, consider this big idea because it is really embedded deeply. It's the idea of changing versus keeping the traditional, and the idea of one's willingness to want, to accept, or to reject change, or even that pace of change, or the idea of maintaining the tradition or moving to something new. So on any of these issues, you're going to see if people feel like they want to move to something that no one has seen before, they want to change quickly, that might move somebody toward the left of the spectrum. If somebody looks at an issue and says, I want to keep it the way it's always been, or fine, I'll accept change, but man, it's got to go a lot slower, or even to change back to something, that might move somebody a little bit more right on the spectrum for that issue. And so where do these beliefs come from? There's a fancy term that's a very easy concept to understand, but the term is political socialization, that we as individuals are formed by many factors in our surroundings. Our families are especially important in shaping what we think, feel, and believe about the world. If our grandparents felt this way, if our parents felt this way, a favorite aunt or uncle, favorite sibling felt this way, we as individuals hear all of those beliefs shared at holiday dinners or in car rides to and from school. We hear all of these ideas that our family has in mind, and so we bounce our formation against those. How the genders see the world can help shape their belief systems. So whether it's a binary male, female, if we have gender non-conforming, gender non-binary, we have trans folks in the world, they're going to see issues differently based on who they are, and how somebody identifies themselves might influence how they see the issue. Race, religion, where people were raised geographically, what level of education people attained. The point is, we as individuals have a lot of things kind of pelting us that we have to account for and think about as we figure out who we are. And so again, we had said this before, the idea of change really helps drive this political spectrum. And so these are generalizations, but in general, somebody who finds themselves on the left end of the spectrum would get that title of liberal on an issue. They tend to believe that change to something that the world has not seen before is a benefit to society. They tend to believe that change should happen more quickly and that that change should be used to fix the problems of society. Whereas a conservative tends to believe that tradition rather than change is the benefit to society. Well, how have we always done it? How have we typically done it? Then that's what we should be doing again. Now, change does come into that conservative philosophy, but conservatives tend to feel that change should happen more slowly, or perhaps that change should be going back to a previous time in order to fix the problems of today. A liberal might say, we have this issue going on today. Let's come up with something new we haven't tried before. Let's figure out how to do this quickly to fix this problem of today. Where a conservative may look at that and say, you know what, 50 years ago, this is how we solved a similar problem. So let's use that today. Or if we're going to come up with something new, then let's just move slowly. Let people have a chance to digest it and figure it out before we just go jumping off the deep end. But before we jump into the political realm, which is where we'll focus most of our semester, consider how these terms apply to other parts of life in terms of change and the word change. Like at the personal level, someone can have what's called a liberal haircut. It's new, something people haven't seen before. It's really on the cutting edge. Somebody might label that a liberal haircut. And the social realm, somebody might prefer a more conservative wedding ceremony. How has it always been done in that family? Okay, they've always had a ceremony that looks like this. That could be a conservative wedding ceremony. Additionally, these terms have changed. Just look at music as a non-political issue. Back in the day, we have the big band era of the 1940s. And then this guy Elvis breaks on the scene, and he's seen as totally new and edgy. Like they wouldn't show him on TV from the waist down because his dance moves were too new. And many people in society said, oh my God, he's too new, he's too cutting edge. And he would have been deemed too liberal for the time period. But then the 60s came about and we get the Beatles. Then you get Elton John, you get Madonna, Run DMC, Adam Lambert, Lady Gaga. Just keep layering on newer and newer different performers. And as somebody new comes on the scene, they're probably pushing the edge of what music is or what performative arts are. And some people are going to love that. They're going to say, that is totally new. I've never heard it. It's great. I used to like this type of music, but now I like this kind. And so you could label those new groups more liberal. They are pushing the change envelope. They are pushing the cutting edge of what's new and changing the pace of music quickly. But then as we look back, would we say that Elvis's music is cutting edge by today's standards? Probably not. Would we say that his dance moves then are offensive now? Probably not, because people dance a lot more offensively or provocatively now than they did in the 1950s. So back in the day, Elvis was seen as too liberal, but now we see him as kind of a conservative voice in the music scene. So these labels can change. Things can evolve. Things can move across the spectrum over time. And so we have said what people think on the issues helps them figure out where they fit on the political spectrum. And so we'll talk about two issues right here, but we have an additional on the issues packet that is embedded throughout the course and throughout the semester. So while we will eventually talk about some of these issues from abortion, affirmative action, death penalty, climate change, immigration, the size of government, etc., we can start this process of just seeing how people think about the issues and how that overlaps with the political spectrum with these two. So for example, the issue of energy use. Liberals tend to desire a focus on new technologies that can produce energy. How can a nation produce energy with something we have not seen before? Okay, the newest stuff, wind, solar, geothermal, etc. And so you see liberals tending to push for energy use to something new. Whereas you see conservatives tend to want energy to come from more traditional technologies. What has our nation used forever? Our nation has used coal. Our nation has used natural gas. That's how our nation has gotten energy for a long, long time. So conservatives tend to look at the world and say, well, how have we always done it? What's tradition? Coal and natural gas. Let's keep our focus there. Let's use it up until it's gone. Whereas liberals, those on the left-hand side of the spectrum, tend to say, well, let's see if we can find something new, find something better, more efficient that we haven't thought of before. On the issue of gun control, liberals tend to desire new laws that would limit gun or ammunition access. Liberals look at this issue and say, okay, so many people have guns have been used in this way, so many people have been killed by guns in all of these different varieties. They look at that issue and say, well, how could we improve society on this issue? What haven't we thought of yet? What if we enacted this new law, this background check, this limit on ammunition? Nobody had done that yet, so why don't we try it? And so looking for change into the new in terms of gun control, that would be the liberal view on that issue. Whereas conservatives tend to focus on the traditional patterns of gun ownership. And that tradition is that there shouldn't be limits. A conservative might look at this and say, there are this many guns in the world, this is how they're being used, this is what's going on. We may not see a problem with that. And if we do, what is the tradition? Well, on that issue, go back to the tradition-forming document, which would be the Constitution and the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment says this, so we believe that that should still be the way we view it in the modern era. No need to do something new. Focus on the traditional in order to address that issue. And so these are the steps we're recommending as we take this political spectrum and start to apply it to ourselves, to our world. Definitely learn as much as you can about any of these issues. Don't just read one article and say, I am now an expert on immigration. Like, there's a lot of stuff out there. Consider what you personally value, not what all the political socialization is hammering away on you to believe, but what do you really believe? And what would you like to see in the world? And then consider the costs and benefits of putting your informed values into action. If you really believe that a wall should be built across the southern border, are there costs and benefits to that action? Is that going to get you the immigration system that you want to see in the world? If you really feel that the size of government should be very large so that many people can be helped by direct government aid, what are the costs and benefits of doing that? And again, embrace your views and whatever label happens to be attached. We are not sitting in judgment saying, oh no, Sally's a liberal or Sally's a conservative. That's not the point at all. We want you to understand the world, you to understand yourself, you to understand the issues, and understand how this concept of the political spectrum works and how it ends up labeling and categorizing our world. And so here is that spectrum again, and this is that concept put into the visual image. You can see it's just a spectrum. You can kind of be anywhere on that line overall. You could also be on that line, anywhere on that line, depending on how you view certain issues. So if we start right in the middle, we have the label of moderate, somebody who doesn't necessarily lean heavily to one side on an issue, maybe doesn't have an opinion, doesn't care about it, or could see strengths on both ends of the spectrum on that issue. If you move to the left, you get the labels of liberal. Okay, so again, moving to the left, you're going to get people who want to see change to something new on that issue. And so if somebody is slightly left of center, they might gain the title of liberal. Somebody who wants more change or somebody who wants faster change might get the title of a progressive, really wanting to move forward on an issue to something that the society hasn't seen before. If you get somebody who wants even more drastic change to something new, or who wants that change like overnight, maybe they get the title of radical, because they are really on the cutting edge of what is new and something that society hasn't seen. And then if you want somebody who is like willing to use violence to get what they want, to something that's new that society hasn't seen before, or they want that change like yesterday and willing to employ violence, you might get the title of revolutionary, drastic change. Somebody who wants drastic change and believe it requires drastic action, like a total revolution, might gain that title of revolutionary. We'll address totalitarian in a second, but go back to your middle. You've got your moderate. Now move to the right. So if you have somebody who looks at an issue and says, I think I'd like to move slowly, or I'd like to use what we've always used in the past to solve this issue, they might have the title of conservative. You move a little bit more to the right. If somebody who wants a little bit more tradition, maybe reaching farther back in history to solve a current problem, you have that idea of a libertarian. Move a little bit more to the right, you again might have somebody labeled as radical. They could be a radical conservative. They really want to stick with tradition on not just one issue, but maybe many issues. Or they really want to go back in time to some previous way of solving the problem and apply that to the current day. But then if you have somebody who really wants to go back to the way things were, really wants to go back in time, they might have the title of reactionary. So somebody that's very conservative, not just maintaining the status quo, not just using tradition, but really turning clocks back to an earlier time, you might have that title of reactionary. Now you can see on both ends of the political spectrum, both extremes, you have the same label of totalitarian. And so as we look at the next slide and we start to put names and faces to some of these to kind of give us some concept here, totalitarianism is the idea of complete control by a leader to achieve these goals. So if you have somebody who is revolutionary on the left, who really wants drastic change, wants it like yesterday, and is willing to use violence to do that, and they're going to control the society so individually by having all the power in their own hands, they're probably going to be seen as totalitarian. They're going to be the leaders who want it their way and only their way. Now, they might be advocating for something that society has not seen yet, so that puts them on the left-hand side, but they are totalitarian because they want total control. At the same time, you could have a right-wing totalitarian leader who so desperately wants to go back in time to something previous, to something that was back in history to apply to the current day. They're willing to use violence. They're willing to be extreme. But again, they want to do it by themselves in some sort of dictator-like stance. You could have a right-wing totalitarian leader. And so now let's put some names and some groups on this spectrum. Now, please know that this spectrum really, in essence, extends to infinity. So there's always going to be somebody more liberal than somebody else or more conservative than somebody else. We are bound by space and by practicality of what this slide can hold. So yes, we have some pretty scary people on here in terms of the very extremes. There's definitely people in between here. So just because the donkey for the Democrats is exactly 3 inches away from Joseph Stalin, former leader of the Soviet Union, that does not mean that they are 3 seconds away from being a horrible dictator who killed millions of people. Take that for what it is. But again, go back to our middle here. You have the moderates, people who maybe believe this or that about certain issues or who don't have an opinion. As you start to move left, you have liberals, you have progressives, you have radicals. The political party that tends to support those ideals would be the Democrats, as demonstrated by the donkey image. But as you move left, are there some Democrats who are more liberal than other Democrats? Are there some Democrats who are so far liberal we might call them progressive? Are there some Democrats who are so far left we might even call them radical? Of course there are. There's always going to be somebody who's more liberal than somebody else. And yes, if you go far off the left end, you get that revolutionary or totalitarian label. You get people like Chairman Mao in China, Stalin, Lenin in the Soviet Union. Did they want to change their nation to something the world had never seen before, the idea of communism? Yeah. At some point, communism, Marxism was new. And so you get these people who wanted to change their society to something so new that no one had ever seen it. They were willing to be violent about it. They wanted action to take place overnight. And they also did it in a totalitarian fashion. They weren't asking people, do you want to become communist? Let's vote on this. No, they were forcing people to move in this direction. They were using violence to move society in that direction. So yes, if you go far enough left, you're going to get totalitarian leaders who had very revolutionary ideas, changed to something society had never seen. Now go back to the middle and let's start moving right. If we have a group of people who are relatively conservative on issues, they might congregate in the Republican Party. They're going to look at the issues that the nation is trying to solve. They're going to look through a conservative lens, through a lens of tradition, through a lens of changing slowly, or even perhaps to changing to something old and bringing it forward and saying, well, it solved the problem 50 years ago, it'll solve the problem now. So Republicans as a party tend to be more conservative. Now, are there some Republicans who are more conservative than others? Of course. Are there some that are very conservative who might earn the title of libertarian? Yes, there are. Can we go farther and farther to the right, just like we did on the left, and see some conservatives who are very radical, who really want to start turning back the clock of the modern day to something that had happened in history? Yes, we can. And if we go far, far off the right wing by comparison, do we have very conservative, reactionary, totalitarian leaders, such as Osama bin Laden, or Hitler, or the Klan? You do. Consider what these groups and people had talked about in terms of what they believed. Bin Laden and the Taliban want to turn the Middle East back to a time when the Middle East was ruled by one kingdom. So the last time that happened was around the year 900. So if they want to bring the year 900 into the current day, is that turning the clock back? It is. Did Hitler want to take Germany and turn it back to a time when there were no Jewish people in Germany and the surrounding areas? He did. Does the Klan want to turn America back to a time when white people had all of the power and there was slavery? They do. And so all of those far right-wing groups and people fit that title of reactionary, but they also did it through violence. They wanted it to happen quickly. They were willing to take up arms in order to achieve their goals. So on either end of the spectrum, if you start getting really far out past that radical label, you get into revolutionary on the left, reactionary on the right, and totalitarian on both ends. People willing to employ violence to get what they want. And so to talk specifically about Democrats and Republicans, because those are the two major political parties in the United States, there are also many other political parties. And so if you're like, well, I don't really think I agree with the platform of the Democrats, or I don't really agree with the platform of the Republicans, there are many other political parties out there. You might be able to find a more nuanced niche for you and your beliefs once you figure out what those are. Additionally, the Democrats and Republicans on our political spectrum are more toward the middle of the overall spectrum. Again, this spectrum conceivably should go on forever, but we are limited in space by the slide and what the screen can hold. So when we are comparing Democrats and Republicans to the extremes of a Stalin, of a Mao, of a Hitler, of a bin Laden, our Republicans and Democrats are very much toward the middle of that spectrum. Even our most extreme politicians are not as extreme as others. So just because the donkey is 2 inches away from Stalin, that does not mean that the Democrats are willing to take up arms like Stalin did and kill 90 million Russians. And just because Hitler is 3 inches away from the elephant for the Republican Party, is 3 inches away from the Republican Party elephant, does not mean that the Republicans are just that super close to eliminating people just like Hitler did. It's a spatial thing. But again, the philosophies of our parties are pretty much toward the middle. They are not as extreme as we've seen other people and parties be throughout history. And one way to look at that is we don't see violence being used as a political tool in the United States. And so while political cartoons and political ads may seek to threaten people and say, hey, if you vote for this person, then America's going to fall apart, we haven't seen that happen in hundreds of years. So violence isn't used as a political tool from our major political parties. So again, they tend to be clustered toward the middle of the spectrum and not identified by the few in the party that are super duper far out on either end. So that's it. A lot of information in this podcast on the political spectrum. And again, this stuff isn't coming from our creation. This information is coming through history, through government study, through political science study. This information is coming through the reading of major political parties' platforms, which we'll talk about in another podcast. This is where political parties put down in writing what they believe. This is not us just being flippant and saying, well, this is what conservatives believe and this is what liberals believe. The parties tell us what they believe. They write it down every 4 years before a presidential election. Having read these party platforms, we know what liberals believe on issues. We know what conservatives believe on these issues. And our challenge to you is to figure out what you believe on these issues, regardless of whatever title that then associates you with. You are who you are. We don't care how you vote. We just care that at some point you do vote and that we hope you fully understand what you're voting for. There's not one right answer. There is a spectrum. You can have many shades of gray within your own belief system and what you think about the different issues, but we just want you to figure out your stance in the world regardless of title. As always, if you have any questions, please bring those into class. We will get those shored up for you and we will move forward from there. Thanks so much, and we'll see you soon.